Hey, traveler. Tonight I thought we'd talk about why you wouldn't last a day in medieval times and more. Where are you in the world right now, and what time is it there? Let me know in the comments. It's wonderful to know where our fellow travelers are joining us from tonight. Ever luxuriate in a hot shower? The kind that melts away the day's stress? Medieval folks, well, they mostly luxuriated in being alive. Cleanliness was a luxury, not a right. Baths were infrequent, communal affairs. Think lukewarm soup you share with your extended family. Now, I know what you are thinking. Sounds gross. Let me tell you, it gets worse. But medieval people weren't dummies. They didn't fail to realize the importance of keeping their hands clean when dealing with food. When available, most would wash their hands with water or a wet rag. But when soap was available, it was typically homemade and made from animal fat and ashes. Ah, the sweet scent of lye and tallow. Sure, you might survive, but your modern nose wouldn't thank you. Key takeaway: medieval hygiene wasn't about smelling nice, it was about staving off illness. Speaking of staving off illness, what's your favorite midnight snack? Perhaps something from the fridge? Picture this situation. You are craving something sweet or salty, something nice, but suddenly you realize that you don't have a fridge, you don't have canned foods, and you don't have the option of ordering a pizza online. Food preservation was a constant battle. Meat was salted, smoked, or dried. Vegetables were pickled or fermented, but fresh was a fleeting concept. Imagine that last piece of chicken slowly becoming suspect. It was always a gamble. You ate it or risked wasting precious resources. Now that we've covered sanitation, let's talk about medieval medicine. You know how a common cold today might warrant a quick trip to the pharmacy for some over-the-counter relief. But medieval people just relied on prayer, herbs, and maybe a little bloodletting. If you've ever complained about a doctor's bill, imagine paying a barber to drain your bad humors. If you were lucky, he also did root canals. But at least you would have a cool bandage. Key takeaway: medieval preservation wasn't about flavor, it was about not dying. Speaking of staying alive, what's your preferred method of indoor illumination? Flicking a switch? Dimming the lights with your phone? Long before smart bulbs, medieval people relied on fire. Candles were expensive, reserved for the wealthy. The rest made do with rushlights, reeds dipped in animal fat. Think smoky, flickering light that barely illuminated the room and smelled faintly of bacon grease. Charming, right? But what good is X without Y? Well, what good is that dim light when you can't read anything? So here's the thing. The medieval population was largely illiterate. Books were precious, hand-copied objects chained to shelves. Reading was a skill reserved for the clergy and the elite. So even if you had light, chances are you couldn't read by it anyway. But from light to literacy, medieval life presented constant challenges to the modern person. Imagine trying to navigate unfamiliar social structures, strange customs, and a world where information traveled at the speed of a horse. Now, what would you do if you disagreed with the local lord? Today, you might write a strongly worded letter to your representative. Back then, well, let's just say dissent was discouraged. The difference was that in the medieval times, you did not have freedom of speech, and there were no political groups. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but the Lord always had to consider the well-being of his people. He had to protect his manor, and there's not much value in a lord if the people he's ruling over start dying off. Key takeaway: when you can't buy light, you make it from whatever burns. What would you do if you lost your phone? Panic, right? Consider this modern equivalent. A smartphone is a portal to the world. Now imagine that you don't have your phone, nor a computer, or a television. You don't have access to Google either. Long before smartphones, medieval people lived in a world defined by their immediate surroundings. News traveled slowly, rumors spread quickly, and your understanding of the world was limited to what you could see and hear. Now that we have considered the world around, let's talk about medieval entertainment. If you are tired of your world, you can just turn the TV or call a friend to hang out. But medieval people didn't have TV, of course. Their entertainment was different. What's your favorite pastime? Binge watching Netflix? Playing video games? Medieval entertainment was far more visceral. Think public executions, bear baiting, and wrestling matches. Not exactly family-friendly by today's standards. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but it was engaging enough to keep them on their toes. So here's the deal. Bear baiting involved chaining a bear to a post and setting dogs on it. Think of it like medieval reality TV, only much, much bloodier. Key takeaway: medieval entertainment was raw, unfiltered, and often quite brutal. Okay, still up? Welcome back. Tonight, let's settle in a bit deeper, shall we? Ever get annoyed by rush hour traffic? The endless stop and go, the fumes, the questionable driving? Picture instead a medieval road. Muddy tracks, really. No traffic lights, no lane markers, just mud. And the occasional ox cart lumbering along at what feels like glacial speed. Now, here's the thing. There were bandits lurking too. Roadside ambushes were a real threat. So even if you did manage to get somewhere, you might arrive lighter in the purse, or not at all. You were better off staying inside the castle walls. Key takeaway? Medieval travel wasn't a commute. It was an adventure. Speaking of questionable fun, what's your take on personal space? Do you appreciate having a bubble around you? Because medieval life, bubble bursting was an Olympic sport. Houses were small, often shared by multiple families. Privacy was a rare commodity. You ate, slept, and lived in close proximity to everyone else. Forget quiet nights reading a book, unless you are very high in status. Your neighbor is practicing the lute again. It was all about that communal life. Now that we've covered the lack of personal space, let's delve into something even more intimate: medieval undergarments. You know how you have drawers full of carefully chosen socks and underwear? Imagine instead scratchy linen shifts worn for days on end. And that was pretty standard, even among the nobility. They might have had better linen, sure, but the concept of fresh was flexible. Remember those communal baths? Yeah, those undergarments were getting a good soak in there, too. Key takeaway? Medieval comfort wasn't about luxury. It was about surviving the day. But what good is comfort without a good night's sleep? What's your mattress situation like? Memory foam? Pillow top? Medieval beds were often straw-filled mattresses, which could be lumpy, buggy, and generally unpleasant. And instead of a cozy duvet, you might have had a heavy wool blanket that smelled faintly of sheep. Sweet dreams. Here's what happened. The straw was replaced infrequently, so over time it became a haven for fleas and other unwanted guests. Speaking of unwanted guests, let's talk about the rats. You know how people freak out about seeing a mouse in their apartment? Medieval towns were infested with rats. They were everywhere. In the streets, in the houses, in the food. Basically, picture a rodent rave. Now that we have considered the rats, let's talk about disease. You know how we have antibiotics, vaccines, and generally a fighting chance against most illnesses? Medieval folks? Not so much. The Black Death, bubonic plague, smallpox, these were constant threats. Even a simple infection could turn deadly. You'd hope that your barber would be able to cure you with a simple bandage. Key takeaway? Medieval health wasn't about thriving. It was about dodging death. From rats to disease, medieval medical practices might send shivers down your spine. Have you ever looked up natural remedies? Now imagine that there is no way to diagnose your disease. You're sick, but the doctor doesn't have the tools to find out what's happening inside your body. He just guesses, and those guesses are pretty off most of the time. Back then, doctors had limited knowledge of anatomy and physiology. Their treatments were based on ancient theories and superstitions. Bloodletting, purging, and herbal remedies were the go-to solutions for everything from a headache to the plague. Speaking of herbal remedies, what's in your medicine cabinet? Probably a mix of over-the-counter drugs and maybe a few prescription medications. Now, imagine your local apothecary dispensing potions made from ground-up beetles, powdered unicorn horn, and various herbs of questionable efficacy. And the prices? Forget about insurance coverage. Paying for medical care could bankrupt a family. Key takeaway? Medieval medicine wasn't about science. It was about hope and a little bit of luck. But what good is hope if you are constantly terrified? What's your biggest fear? Spiders? Heights? Imagine living in a world where the devil was a very real, very present threat. Demons lurked around every corner, tempting people to sin and dragging them to hell. Religious paranoia was rampant. Witch hunts were a common occurrence. Just being accused of witchcraft could lead to torture and execution. You're probably scared of not being able to sleep. Now that we have considered fears, let's talk about justice. You know how our legal system is supposed to be fair and impartial. Medieval justice, let's just say it was a bit more hands-on. Trial by ordeal was a thing. Accused of a crime? Prove your innocence by holding a hot iron or plunging your hand into boiling water. If God was on your side, you wouldn't be burned. Spoiler alert, people got burned. Key takeaway? Medieval justice wasn't about fairness. It was about power. Speaking of power, what's your relationship with authority like? Do you vote, protest, write letters to your elected officials? Medieval peasants had very little say in their own lives. They were bound to the land, subject to the whims of their lord. Disobedience could be met with swift and brutal punishment. Sure, it wasn't perfect, but the Lord always had to consider the well-being of his people. Sort of. He had to protect his manor. Now that we've considered power, let's talk about death. We mostly try to avoid thinking about it, right? Medieval people, though, death was a constant companion. Life expectancy was short. Child mortality rates were high. Disease, famine, and violence were always lurking. Death wasn't a distant abstraction. It was an everyday reality. The average person lived to be about 30 years old. What would you do? It's tough to imagine ourselves living in a time like this. Sure, the medieval era has its charm, but the fact is, it was a world of extreme hardship and danger. There's a reason why it's called the Dark Ages. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, maybe take a moment to appreciate the comforts of your modern life. Running water, central heating, antibiotics, and democracy are all pretty amazing. Good night and sleep well.
Okay. Still awake? Good. Let's continue our little nighttime journey, shall we? We've already tiptoed through muddy roads and shared some rather intimate moments with medieval strangers. Tonight, we're digging a bit deeper into the daily grind, if you can even call it that, of the medieval world. Ever complain about doing laundry, sorting whites from colors, dealing with that one sock that always disappears? Imagine laundry day in medieval times. No washing machines, no detergents, just you, a tub of questionable water, and a whole lot of elbow grease. And the detergent? Often lye, made from wood ashes. Harsh stuff. Clothing was precious, so they only did laundry a few times a year. Imagine the smell. Even royalty didn't have the luxury of washing their clothes every day. It was a whole production. Key takeaway? Medieval cleanliness wasn't about hygiene. It was about preservation. Now that we've covered laundry, let's talk about food. You know how you can just pop into the grocery store and grab whatever your heart desires. Medieval people, not so much. Their diets were heavily reliant on what they could grow or raise themselves. Seasons dictated the menu. Winter was a bleak time, often involving salted meat and whatever root vegetables they had managed to store. Summer was better, with fresh fruits and vegetables if the harvest was good. If the harvest failed and you were a peasant, starvation was a very real threat. Your modern-day cleanse is a walk in the park compared to that. Speaking of harvests, what's your stance on eating meat? Do you enjoy a juicy steak every now and then? Medieval peasants rarely had that luxury. Meat was expensive and often reserved for the nobility. Their protein source was usually beans and lentils. If they were lucky, they might snare a rabbit or a bird. And let's not even talk about the preparation. No refrigeration, so the meat had to be consumed quickly or preserved by salting or smoking. Key takeaway? Medieval cuisine wasn't about gourmet, it was about sustenance. But what good is sustenance without flavor? You know how we have spices from all over the world at our fingertips? Medieval folks, spices were a luxury, incredibly expensive and highly sought after. They were used to mask the taste of food that was often less than fresh. Common seasonings included herbs like sage, thyme, and rosemary, which they grew in their gardens. Imagine if you could only ever eat food with those three flavors. Your taste buds would be staging a revolt. Key takeaway? Medieval cuisine wasn't about gourmet, it was about sustenance. But what good is sustenance without flavor? You know how we have spices from all over the world at our fingertips? Medieval folks, spices were a luxury, incredibly expensive and highly sought after. They were used to mask the taste of food that was often less than fresh. Common seasonings included herbs like sage, thyme, and rosemary, which they grew in their gardens. Imagine if you could only ever eat food with those three flavors. Your taste buds would be staging a revolt. Key takeaway? Medieval cuisine wasn't about gourmet, it was about sustenance. Now that we have considered seasonings, let's talk about what you actually drank. Water wasn't always safe to drink, so what was the alternative? Ale and beer. Yes, even for kids. The alcohol content was low, but it was safer than the water. Wine was also consumed, especially by the wealthy. Imagine trying to concentrate in your meeting after having a beer at lunch. Actually, maybe some meetings would be better. Key takeaway? Medieval hydration wasn't about purity, it was about avoiding dysentery. From questionable water to low-alcohol beer, let's venture into the realm of teeth. What's your dental routine like? Brushing, flossing, maybe a visit to the dentist every 6 months? Medieval dental care? Non-existent for most. They might try to rub their teeth with a cloth or a twig, but that was about it. Toothaches were common, and tooth loss was practically guaranteed. If you were lucky, a barber surgeon might pull the offending tooth without anesthesia. Your dentist might be expensive, but at least he's not using pliers and brute force. Speaking of barber surgeons, this brings us to healthcare. You know how you can see a specialist for every ailment imaginable? Medieval healthcare was a bit more general. The local barber surgeon handled everything from haircuts to amputations. Monks also practiced medicine, relying on herbal remedies and prayer. And if all else failed, well, there was always God. Maybe your modern doctor runs late, but at least he probably isn't juggling haircuts with setting broken bones. Key takeaway? Medieval medical specialization wasn't a thing. It was about the barber knowing a little bit of everything. But what good is a doctor without sanitation? Think about your bathroom. Indoor plumbing, running water, flush toilet. Medieval sanitation, let's just say it was a bit more rustic. Chamber pots were common, and their contents were often emptied into the streets. Remember those rats? They were having a field day. Forget social distancing. It was a daily deluge of unsanitary conditions. Now that we have considered sanitation, let's talk about light. You know how you can just flip a switch and have instant illumination? Medieval lighting was a bit more labor-intensive. Candles were expensive, made from beeswax or tallow. The poor relied on rushlights, made from reeds dipped in grease. They produced a flickering, smoky light and smelled interesting. Imagine reading by the light of a tallow candle. Your eyes would be screaming for mercy. Key takeaway? Medieval illumination wasn't about brightness, it was about chasing away the darkness. From flickering candles to smoky rushlights, let's consider entertainment. What do you do for fun? Movies, concerts, video games. Medieval entertainment was a bit more participatory. There were festivals, markets, and fairs. Traveling minstrels and storytellers provided music and tales. Jousting tournaments were popular among the nobility. And of course, there was always the spectacle of a public execution. Now that's one show you definitely wouldn't want front row seats to. Speaking of executions, this brings us to law and order. You know how we have police forces and courts of law? Medieval law enforcement was a bit more localized. The lord of the manor was responsible for maintaining order. Punishments were often harsh and public. The stocks, the pillory, and the gallows were common sights. Justice was swift and often brutal. A parking ticket suddenly doesn't seem so bad, does it? Key takeaway? Medieval justice wasn't about rehabilitation, it was about deterrence. But what good is law and order without security? You know how you can lock your doors and windows and feel relatively safe?
Okay, still with me? The nights deepened, the stars are a little brighter, and we've wandered through quite a bit of medieval life together. Before the sun peaks over the horizon, let's linger a little longer and explore the whispers and secrets that even the smoky rushlights couldn't quite illuminate. Ever felt that pang of guilt after a particularly indulgent meal? Imagine that feeling amplified by the sheer fact that you were the indulgence.
Let's talk about body image. Today, we're bombarded with images of idealized figures. But medieval times, a plump physique was often seen as a sign of prosperity and good health, especially for women. Thinness, particularly among the poor, was a sign of hardship and illness. Of course, this didn't apply across the board. Nobility still strived for a certain elegance. The difference was that access to food dictated the paradigm. So maybe next time you're tempted to beat yourself up about that extra slice of cake, remember you're just channeling your inner medieval noble. Key takeaway? Medieval beauty standards weren't about aesthetics. It was about survival and status. Now that we've considered the body, let's talk about the mind. You know how we stress the importance of mental health today? Therapy, mindfulness, meditation. Medieval folks had their own ways of coping with the stresses of life. Religion played a huge role, providing solace and a sense of community. But there were also folk remedies, superstitions, and rituals that helped them navigate the anxieties of a world filled with uncertainty. Did they know about cortisol or serotonin? Of course not. But when your daily life involves dodging plague rats and praying for a good harvest, a little superstition probably helps. Speaking of coping mechanisms, this brings us to leisure. You know how we unwind with Netflix or video games? Medieval leisure activities were often tied to the seasons and the agricultural calendar. There were festivals, fairs, and markets. People gathered to dance, sing, and tell stories. Games of chance were popular, as were sports like wrestling and archery. And of course, there was always the simple pleasure of socializing with friends and family. Sure, they didn't have the internet, but they had each other. And sometimes, that's all you need. Key takeaway? Medieval recreation wasn't about escape. It was about connection and community. But what good is leisure without love? You know how we have dating apps and romantic comedies? Medieval courtship was a bit more structured. Marriages were often arranged, especially among the nobility, for political and economic reasons. But that didn't mean love was absent. Courtly love, with its elaborate rituals and poetic expressions, was a popular theme in literature and art. And among the common folk, love blossomed in fields, villages, and around the hearth. When your options are limited, a little romance goes a long way. Now that we've talked about love, let's talk about loss. You know how we grieve the death of a loved one? Medieval mourning rituals were often elaborate and deeply rooted in religious beliefs. Death was a constant presence, and people were accustomed to facing it head-on. Funerals were important social events, and the bereaved were expected to observe strict periods of mourning. They might not have had modern therapy, but they had a whole community sharing the burden of grief. Key takeaway? Medieval bereavement wasn't about denial. It was about acceptance and communal support. From love and loss, let's venture into the realm of art. You know how we have museums and galleries filled with masterpieces? Medieval art was often commissioned by the church or the nobility. It served a variety of purposes: to educate, to inspire, and to glorify God or the ruling class. But there was also art created by ordinary people, folk art, crafts, and songs that expressed their hopes, fears, and dreams. Their art wasn't always pretty, but it was always honest. Speaking of honesty, this brings us to social justice. You know how we fight for equality and human rights today? Medieval society was deeply hierarchical, and social inequality was rampant. But that didn't mean people were blind to injustice. There were peasant revolts, religious movements, and individual acts of defiance that challenged the status quo. They might not have had Twitter, but they had pitchforks and righteous anger. Key takeaway? Medieval rebellion wasn't about hashtags. It was about survival and demanding basic rights. But what good is justice without mercy? You know how we debate the merits of restorative justice? Medieval justice, as we discussed, was often harsh and unforgiving. But there were also instances of mercy, forgiveness, and compassion. Sometimes a lord would pardon a criminal, or a priest would offer solace to the condemned. Even in the darkest of times, the human spirit could shine through. Sure, the justice system was flawed, but sometimes a little grace was enough to tip the scales. Now that we've considered mercy, let's talk about innovation. You know how we celebrate technological advancements? Medieval times were not static. There were important innovations in agriculture, technology, and science. The heavy plow, the watermill, and the printing press were all developed during this period. These inventions transformed society and laid the foundation for the modern world. They might not have had smartphones, but they had the ingenuity to make life a little easier. Speaking of easier, this brings us to community. You know how we struggle to find a sense of belonging in our fragmented society? Medieval people lived in close-knit communities. They relied on each other for support, protection, and companionship. They shared their joys and sorrows, their hopes and fears. They were bound together by a common sense of identity and purpose. In a world full of uncertainty, their community was their anchor. Key takeaway? Medieval society wasn't about individualism. It was about the strength found in unity. But what good is community without faith? You know how we grapple with questions of meaning and purpose? In medieval times, faith was the bedrock of society. It provided answers to life's big questions, a framework for moral behavior, and a sense of hope for the future. People believed in something bigger than themselves. Whether you share their beliefs or not, you can't deny the power of faith to shape lives and communities. From faith and community, let's consider the small joys. You know how we appreciate the simple pleasures in life? A warm cup of coffee, a beautiful sunset, a kind word. Medieval people had their own small joys: the taste of fresh bread, the warmth of a fire, the sound of children laughing. Even in the midst of hardship and uncertainty, they found moments of happiness and contentment. And those moments, however fleeting, made life worth living. Imagine being excited about a new pair of shoes when most people only have one pair of shoes their whole life. Perspective is everything. Now that we've considered the small joys, let's return to where we started: sleep, or rather, the pursuit of it. Perhaps as you lie awake tonight, you find yourself feeling a little closer to those medieval souls we've been visiting. Their struggles were different, their challenges unique, but their humanity resonates across the centuries. They yearned for comfort, for connection, for meaning, just as we do. And so, as the first rays of dawn begin to paint the sky,